Welcome, everybody. I hope you can hear me. I hope the microphone's working okay. I'm Nick Pearce. I'm the director of the Institute for Policy Research here at the university, and the Institute has been established by the university to bridge the divide between policy and academia, to engage in questions of public policy, and to take the research of the university, take its concerns into policy making and engagement with public policy issues and decision makers. And we run a programme of public lectures. This is one of those. In that programme, if you've been to them before, you'll know the format. And we want to open our work up to not just to the university and its students and its academics, but also to the wider public. So if you're here from the City of Bath itself, a big welcome to you too. Today, or this evening I should say, we are very pleased to welcome Professor David Nutt from Imperial College, as you can see up here, Professor of Neuropsychopharmacology. David is a distinguished academic, but he's also somebody that has engaged throughout his career in policy making. Probably most notably, I should say, as the chair of the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs, and is now currently chair of Drug Science UK, which is a very important organisation for the science of drugs and alcohol policy. And he's also a public intellectual. He engages in public debate, a frequent contributor to radio and television. You will have seen him, I'm sure, down the years, or heard him on the radio discussing drugs and alcohol policy, and in particular in recent months with the government's new legislation just received royal assent on so-called legal highs. This has been an important question in public debate, and one I know that Professor Nutt will touch on in his lecture this evening. So we're very, very grateful to have you here, David, very pleased to have you, and I'm sure that the issues that you raise will be very important ones, very, very contentious and challenging ones for public debate, so we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, well, it's great to be here. It's great to be here for a number of reasons. One of which is I can remember when you were in Bristol. That was before the university was founded, and you were down the back streets by the cathedral. So you've done extremely well, and congratulations. And it's nice to be back. This is the third time I think I've given a public lecture on this kind of topic in Bath. So about every 2 years you invite me, which is about right, because the field changes so fast that even in a couple of weeks things can be very different from how they were before. I want to ask one question. I want to ask one question of you before I kick off, which is, if you've got a phone that can do Twitter, will you please follow me now? Because I'm desperate to get to 35,000 before the end of the week. So just a few words about me. Well, I'm a psychiatrist. I like to say, well, with a name like Nutt, there aren't many careers in medicine. I went into medicine to do research, and I've been doing research pretty much all my professional career alongside clinical work. And I worked on the effects of drugs in the brain, and I've been fairly successful in terms of publishing. I had 4 children, and thankfully they're all still alive, just. So I've seen a lot of things that happen when children go through teenage years in the current climate. I've seen a lot of very, very drunk teenagers, and I've seen teenagers taking other things as well. And that's made me a lot wiser and more knowledgeable about these issues. But, as was just mentioned in the introduction, the only reason any of you know of me, apart from my friends here, and there are 3, I think, is that I was a government drugs advisor. For 9 years, I chaired what you might call the scientific committee of the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs. And because I was so good at doing that, so they promoted me to chair of the full council, the ACND. And there I had run-ins with 2 Home Secretaries, which led to my being sacked. And then I went from being just an obscure psychiatrist with a funny name to being a sort of centre of worldwide attention about drugs and drug policy. And I have to be conscious, knowing that Lord Equal actually has had a role in that government, but one problem with the Labour Party is it doesn't learn the lessons of history, and it should have remembered what Margaret Thatcher said about the IRA. Don't give them the oxygen of publicity. And sacking me publicly was a very silly thing to do, because I'd had 3 interviews on TV within the hour of being sacked, and the best the government could do was have Alan Johnson on Sky News 2.5 days later. So they didn't really understand the rules about engagement at the time. So you know about me now. Unfortunately, we have there's a little glitch here, a slight problem with your IT. Anyway, that's an image of me being sacked, which doesn't. It's always been censored. So I was sacked for saying that, that essentially the hysteria around drugs like ecstasy and cannabis was inappropriate for their relative levels of harm, and actually, in many ways, is almost a ploy to avoid confronting the real problem in our society of alcohol, and to some extent tobacco, and that didn't go down very well. Particularly the comment I made that cannabis was actually less harmful than alcohol, but as you'll see on the next slide, I now know I was right, because a couple of years ago, President Obama agreed, and this is a truly momentous statement, because it's certainly the first time in my living history that an American president has ever told the truth about drugs. And cannabis is less harmful than alcohol, even in America. And for that reason, tonight I am wearing a Harvard tie to celebrate Obama's telling the truth about drugs. And it's particularly important because it says veritas. And one of the problems with thinking about drugs is that veritas, truth, for those of you who don't know Latin, is something that's in extraordinary short supply. And that statement was important. It stopped the feds destroying cannabis pharmacies in states like California, where the population had voted to have medical marijuana, even which is illegal in federal areas, but is legal in many states. About 200,000 Americans now have access to medical marijuana, but it's illegal to have it under federal law. And Obama did not want a war between the feds and the pharmacists. And the feds wanted a war, of course, because that's how they get paid. But he didn't want that, so he said, no, we're not going to fight that war anymore. But that statement had ramifications way beyond America, because until that point, the US had been controlling international drugs policy and was insisting that all countries complied with the UN conventions, which it wrote, that cannabis should stay as a Schedule I drug. And when you cannot control your own states, you certainly have lost any kind of intellectual capacity to control other countries. You may still have financial powers over those countries, and those will certainly be welded, but the moral authority has now gone, and that's going to change the whole tenure of the debate about the drugs. There's a vacuum now which Russia is trying to fill, but we just hope that Britain won't follow Russia's lead on that, as we've followed the American lead. So I'm a scientist of sorts, and as a scientist, I'm interested in a fundamental question, really. What is a drug? You might be amazed to know that the United Nations Conventions and the British Misuse of Drugs Act does not define a drug. So we have to. And this, I've decided on what you might call a policy decision, a definition. This is my definition. So Jackie Smith was a Home Secretary with whom I had an interesting dialogue about the comparative harms of horse riding and ecstasy. And when she was made Home Secretary, she was asked the question that they all get asked, have you taken any drugs? And instead of telling the truth, which was, yes, but I only drink half a bottle of Chardonnay a night, she said, I smoke cannabis, but I didn't enjoy. And that's a very interesting statement for a Home Secretary to make, for two reasons. The first is that not enjoying is not a defense in law. And the second is this, and I don't know, you might be able to help me, but do we know why she smoked cannabis? And I don't know why. I never actually got around to asking her. It didn't seem appropriate when we were talking about horse riding, but I suspect the answer would be to get into the Labour Party in Oxford at the time. That's what you had to do. And then there's David Cameron, and he said when he became leader of the Tory party, I did things when young that I shouldn't have. We all did. Now, that, I think, is called the Eton we, otherwise known as the Conservative front bench. And when he made that statement, we knew of certain things. We knew, actually, he'd done cannabis and cocaine, but there were certain other things we hadn't understood he did at the time. We don't even know if he has now, but they weren't. Anyway, we don't know. We won't pursue that. I like this man, the future leader of our country, in his own mind. There's Boris saying it's an outrageous... but not European ones. We say. This is what the drinks industry wants you to think. The drinks industry have campaigned and continue to campaign ferociously to make people, like governments, believe that alcohol is not a drug. Try this experiment when you go home. Speak to your mother or your father and say, is alcohol a drug? And they'll say, what have you been taking? And then you say, no, but seriously, is alcohol a drug? And they say, of course not. And you say, but why do you use it if it doesn't make you feel different? And if you take a lot, you might get drunk and you might fall over. You could even have a hangover. Of course it's a drug. And they'll look at you as if you're bonkers, and they'll say, look, if it was a drug, it would be illegal. And this illegality paradox permeates the whole of policy making. It's not just limited to drugs. You see it in all other aspects of life as well. But the drug one is a very powerful mystique. If something's illegal, it's dangerous and must stay illegal. And if it's not illegal, it's not dangerous. And the alcohol industry spends billions a year persuading us that alcohol is actually not a drug. It's a lifestyle choice. It's a drink. It's a necessary way of lubricating conversation during meals, etc., but it's not a drug. If alcohol was invented today, and one of you clever people decided it was a great way of making trifles taste better, you could then approach the Food Standards Agency and say, I've got this new taste, this new food additive for trifles. Can I sell it? And they'd say, sure, you can sell it, but you've got to do some safety studies. And you do the safety studies they told you, and you come back and you'd say to them, okay, is it safe? And they say, yes, it's safe, but the maximum exposure for any one individual in a whole year is half a glass of wine per year. That's how toxic it is if you apply the same rules as you apply to other food additives. So we have a very special place in our decision making for alcohol, because almost all of us drink. Most of us would prefer it not to be as damaging as it is, and we really want to pretend it isn't harmful, but it is. It is seriously harmful. So that sets me up for this little quiz. Who's heard of Amy Winehouse? Her legacy lives on. Good. Brilliant film. You should see the film. It's for all sorts of reasons. Did she die of a drug overdose? Who thinks she died of a drug overdose? Who thinks she died of an alcohol overdose? Who thinks she died of both drugs and alcohol? Well, it's a trick question because I'm feeling generous and they're all right. Everyone's got the right answer. She died of a drugs overdose, but it was just an alcohol overdose. And Amy's story is fascinating because if you see the film, you realize she was a heroin addict, but it was alcohol that killed her because she was also an alcohol addict. And she gave up heroin, and then subsequently she gave up alcohol. And she met the criteria that the current government says is the definition of recovery. She had been clean from alcohol for 6 weeks. And then she relapsed. And as most people, there's almost no one gives up a drug and never relapses. Most people, if they're trying to stop using a drug like alcohol, relapse 5 to 20 times before they give up. And she relapsed, and she drank a litre of vodka, and she died. Now, when she died, I assume, like most of you, from this little poll we've taken, that she had taken a mixture of drugs and alcohol, but no, it was just alcohol. And in fact, alcohol poisoning kills about 3 people a week in this country, usually young people like her. There's only one project in the whole country going on to try to find ways of stopping people like Amy, who are cured, abstinent, relapsing and dying. And that's an MRC project we've got to try to find drugs which can help people cope with abstinence and stop relapse or abstinence. But it's a massive problem. And it's almost completely ignored because of this simplistic, almost puerile belief that this government has that stopping use of a drug for 6 weeks is proof that you're cured. Now, death is a very useful metric because it's a final thing. There's no going back. It's unequivocal. You're dead. And if you're interested in how drugs affect life, then we look at deaths. And you see from these data that tobacco is still by far and away the leading cause of premature death in people in Britain today. Over 80,000 deaths. But they're mostly in middle-aged to old people who've had their lives and at least done something, at least procreated and produced the next generation. Alcohol is about 20,000 or so, and they're a mixture of young and old. Then you have opiates with about 1,200, you have paracetamol with about 200, cocaine round about 200, and then amphetamines about 40. And the drugs that the media love to vilify, like cannabis and ecstasy, and in that case, mephedrone, are virtually free of deaths. So there's a sort of paradox here, that the very dangerous drugs, the drugs that are killing people, are legal drugs. If you're interested in stopping deaths, which actually government's drug policy has never been interested in death, it's just been interested in use. But if you had a rational policy and said, well, what other deaths can we prevent if we can't prevent drug deaths? Well, you might look at these preventable deaths. So you could stop people going on holiday to the Caribbean or to the Mediterranean and stop sunbeds. You might stop 2,000 deaths a year from melanoma. If you stop people driving, you might stop 2,500 deaths, of which some are drug-related and alcohol-related. Suicide, 6,000, and AIDS, about 400. So if you care about deaths, then you have to care about drugs like alcohol and tobacco, because those are preventable deaths. And here's a chilling statistic that alcohol is now the leading cause of death in men under the age of 50. And by the end of this decade, the way women are drinking, it'll be the leading cause of death in women under the age of 50. Now, you'd have thought that was actually something that government should care about. I mean, as a doctor, I care about that quite a lot. As a parent, I care about that even more. But we don't have any policies that are proven effective in trying to reduce this death rate. And in fact, the most chilling statistic was the data that came out just 2 weeks ago. In 2014, the latest data, there was a 6% increase in mortality, alcohol-induced mortality for women in 1 year, and 3% in men. You know, I would have thought that might be something health policy makers might be interested in. You know, we have hysteria about Ebola, but we don't mind if there's this massive increase in deaths from alcohol. And of course, one of the reasons for that is that most politicians take some money in some way from the drinks industry. I like to show this graph because this graph spans my medical career. I started working as a doctor in 1971, and in that year they started collecting data on mortality from different disorders. And this graph here shows you the death rates, standardized mortality rates, for a whole range of different organ systems. And you can see over the 40 years since they started collecting that death rates from respiratory disease, heart disease, road traffic accidents, endocrine diseases, blood diseases, they've all gone down, some of them to a third of what they were in 1970, which is what you'd expect. As a society, you should be getting healthier because we know a lot about illness. We're being fed better in childhood. And medicine's better. And the reason we collect these data is to give us a clue as to whether medicine is getting better. And it is for everything except liver deaths. And isn't it strange that liver deaths have gone in the other direction? So they're 4 times greater than they were in 1970. And this increase in liver deaths is driven largely by alcohol. Now you might say, well, for the first 5 years, that could be within statistical error. Maybe the next 5 years, well, that's, unlikely to be just a statistical artifact. At 15 years, you know this is a fact. So what does the government do? It does the opposite of what it should do. It liberates the consumption of alcohol by allowing it to be bought in supermarkets 24/7. And we get this massive increase in liver deaths. So we've done exactly the right thing for the industry and exactly the wrong thing for our society. Again, by the end of this decade, liver deaths will exceed heart deaths for men. And alcohol is about the only preventable thing you can do to prevent certain cancers. So here you have an example of the illustrations of the kind of cancers which are caused by drinking. And I just want to say to the women in the audience, alcohol is the only known cause of cancer that you can do anything about, breast cancer. So why didn't we do anything? And I started working in this field. I mean, I've been doing research in drugs for a long time, all my life. But I started getting interested in policy when Tony Blair had a cabinet committee in about the turn of the century to look at drugs and drug harms. And I was on that working group. And we worked hard, which is a rather good document. And then when it got published, we noticed that all reference to alcohol was removed. And we said, why is that? And they said, well, we consulted with the drinks industry and they said we were wrong. And we said, well, what do you mean we were wrong? And they said, well, there are health benefits of alcohol as well as health harms. And therefore, we couldn't really comment on controlling alcohol. And we said, actually, that shouldn't have been your decision. You should have let the experts, rather than the civil servants, eliminate all reference to alcohol in that report. And these are the data. These are the data on which the decision to exclude alcohol from the drugs policy was built. So this is the so-called J-shaped curve. This is the health benefit of alcohol, supposedly on cardiovascular disease in middle-aged men. These are all the harms. See, some of them are massive. But this is what the drinks industry has persuaded government after government is good enough to avoid doing anything about the sale of alcohol. Now, if that's true, which it isn't, but just suppose you believe those data, suppose you think there is a health benefit, the optimal consumption of alcohol to produce that benefit is about half a unit. So when you go home tonight and you're thinking, and you're talking to your partner, and he says, while you're drinking, you say, for the health benefits, you say, right, you can only have a third of a glass of wine. Alternatively, the students amongst you go out, buy a pint, and have 3 straws, and that way you get to meet other people as well. And this myth of the health benefits of alcohol is perpetuated by the drinks industry. It's parroted by many politicians, and it's just a lie. Now, one of the things I managed to achieve when I was working for the Home Office in the ACMD was to systematise the way in which we assess the harms of drugs. When I joined that committee, I was horrified to discover that when the chair said, what do we think about ecstasy, people said, oh, it's terrible. Oh, it's very terrible. It's even more terrible than terrible. You say, well, hang on, how does that compare with barbiturates? Oh, they're terrible too. Well, how terrible compare with ecstasy? Well, it doesn't matter, they're all terrible. So I said, before taking the job, I said, I'm only going to do this job if we can have a systematic, scientific way of assessing drugs. And over the years, we worked on different schemes, and this is the result of the most sophisticated analysis of drugs harm ever done. So we worked out, using a whole range of experts, that there are 16 different ways in which drugs can harm you. 9 of them relate to the harm a drug does to you as a user, and 7 relate to the harms of drugs to society. And then we went away and spent a whole weekend with a group of experts looking at the harms of 20 different drugs on these 16 different variables. And in the end, this graph came out, this rather famous graph now. So this is a ranking of the harms of 20 drugs in the UK. And you see, and to my surprise, I was surprised. I didn't think it would come out number 1, because previous studies we'd done using less sophisticated analyses had shown alcohol was 4 or 5. But here, using the best analysis we have, alcohol is the most harmful drug in the UK. And that harm is driven largely by this massive red bar. The red bar is the harm of alcohol to society. And of course, that's huge, because 87% of British population drink, so it's an extremely prevalent drug. But alcohol is responsible for over 2/3 of child abuse, probably 90% of spousal violence, a vast amount of, at least over half of acquisitive crime, burglaries, a lot of traffic accidents. It costs the health service nearly $4 billion a year. It costs about $7 billion a year just to police drunkenness on our streets. So the costs of alcohol to society are enormous. It's not the most harmful drug to the user. The most harmful drug to the user here is crack, and then there's heroin and crystal meth. But overall, in the UK society, if we care about drug harms, we should be doing something about alcohol. And it's sort of paradoxical. The drugs, again, that the media get hysterical about are hardly harming society at all, and don't have as much harm to the user as alcohol. And this was the graph that I was talking about on the Today programme, and that's what got me sacked. And one of the reasons I was sacked was that we had an ongoing battle with various Home Secretaries over this drug cannabis. There's Alan Johnson, the man who sacked me. There's me in the spliff. And these are the other scientists who were sacked at the same time. And, well, they resigned when I was sacked. Cannabis is not just a drug. Cannabis is a very powerful political tool. And both current and past governments have seen cannabis as a really interesting and powerful way of manipulating voters. And Alan Johnson, well, actually, I don't know if he cared at all, but certainly Gordon Brown wanted cannabis reclassified from Class C to Class B because he'd had a very interesting interaction with the Daily Mail, who said they'd support Labour in the election if he did that. A kind of strange arrangement. It's a bit like, selling your soul to the devil. But, that's the arrangement, and the plan was then cannabis had to be reclassified to satisfy the Mail, and for the Mail to then follow Labour support Labour in the next election, which actually they didn't do, despite the fact that the Labour Party did their share of the bargain. Now, cannabis is rather different from alcohol in that we've gone from a situation where virtually no one used it in 1970 to where, when we have the latest data, which is still a bit old now, about 20 million people had used it. So 10 million people. So we had a 20-fold increase in cannabis use over that period from 1970 to the present day. And in terms of consumption of cannabis, it must be more like 50 to 100 times increase in use. So you might imagine if cannabis was harmful and people we'd have seen a harm. But I showed you there are no deaths. And that presents governments with a problem. If the drug doesn't kill people, how can you justify controlling it? And the last government, and this one, decided to focus on 3 areas where they could scare the public: skunk, driving, and schizophrenia. And I should say, by the way, the reason cannabis is no longer a medicine in this country was because the Americans put a lot of pressure on us in the 1960s and 70s to remove it, because they didn't believe, they believed, as this current government does, that medical cannabis is a gateway to recreational use, which is absurd. But that was a justification for making cannabis no longer a medicine back in the 1970s. But keeping cannabis illegal is based on these 3 principles. Let's look at skunk. Why do we have skunk? Skunk is a product of prohibition, people growing their home rather than importing it from Morocco. And if you're going to expend energy growing plants, you tend to grow plants with the highest density, strength of THC. So skunk is a sort of, it's a scare because it's a stronger form of cannabis. Now, we've seen amazing claims made about skunk. And these claims are all made by supposed scientists. One of those claims was made by the president of the Royal College of GPs. One was made by someone who almost became the government's chief scientist. Thankfully, they didn't. And one was made by someone who is supposedly a leading psychiatrist. And they're all ridiculous. But you can get scientists at senior levels to make ridiculous statements to appease both government desires and the media. And then, after the deal with the Mail, Gordon Brown started talking about the lethality of skunk, which I presume is a Scottish word for the fact it smells, I don't know. The reality of skunk is that skunk is about 15% THC, so skunk to resin or hash is like wine to beer. Now, we all have learnt not to drink beer by the pint, haven't we? Well, except maybe the students here, I don't know. But the reality is that to be frightened of something because it's strong is naive unless you don't tell people what the strength is. However, there is possibly one other problem with the mutation, morphing of cannabis to skunk, which is that it's lost cannabidiol. If you grow a lot of THC, the plant can't make cannabidiol. And cannabidiol is a kind of protective product in the plant, which does have it does attenuate some of the more extreme, probably some of the more paranoid-inducing effects of cannabis. But most people, when they use skunk, they don't use as much as they use hash, so they self-titrate. The traffic fear is extraordinarily exaggerated. Being stoned doubles your risk of a road traffic accident. Being drunk increases it about eightfold, and the two together are additive. So again, if you care about harms, you do something about alcohol. We have the second highest drink driving threshold in the world after Tanzania. And then there was schizophrenia. Why do we... So this idea that cannabis causes schizophrenia was actually what Alan Johnson said in Parliament when Chris Huhne, who was and the Lib Dems were very supportive of me. They opposed my sacking. And Johnson said, and also Nutt says that cannabis does not cause schizophrenia, whereas Professor Murray and even a prison governor, who I met last week, told me it does. And, well, that's great, Alan, but the reality is that 20-fold increase in the number of cannabis users has not translated into any increase in the prevalence or the incidence of schizophrenia or even psychosis. Not in Britain, these are the MRC data, or any other country in the world where that massive increase in use has happened. So this is a fiction, but it's a convenient fiction because it allows the media and politicians to scare people into keeping cannabis controlled. In fact, if you believe the one piece of data which is almost powered enough to ask the question, does cannabis cause schizophrenia? The 1957 Swedish conscript study. If you believe that data, which is not actually true, but it's good enough, if you believe that, then you've got to stop 5,000 young men or 7,000 young women from ever smoking cannabis to stop one case of schizophrenia. Now, that's a number needed to treat, in medical terms, of 5,000. You don't invest in any treatment that has a number needed to treat of more than 20. So it's ridiculous to think that you can actually intervene with schizophrenia by trying to stop cannabis use, particularly trying to stop cannabis use for criminalizing young men. However, Jackie Smith said this: my decision to reclassify cannabis takes into account issues such as public perception, which of course was generated by the media, policing priorities, which have really nothing to do with whether a drug is illegal or not, and where there is a clear and serious problem, but doubt about the potential harm, we must err on the side of caution and protect the public. I make no apology for that. I'm not prepared to wait and see. To which my response was, well, that's all very well, Jackie, but we know alcohol is killing, at that time, 15,000 people a year. There isn't any doubt. Do something about it. And the response was just nothing, because governments really hate people pointing out that alcohol is a problem. And that's fundamentally dishonest. And then, of course, the policing priorities were rapidly turned into incentivizing the police to catch young men possessing cannabis. And there are 1 million young men in this country now who've got criminal convictions for possessing cannabis. They're an underclass. They can't get jobs in teaching or the police or the civil service or the military. So what do? Well, they do minor theft and they deal drugs. And one of the reasons we had the riots in London and other cities was because there was just a lot of resentment to the fact that their lives were being ruined. Giving a criminal record for possessing cannabis destroys your life trajectory. And they knew that was unfair, and they resent the fact that the police who arrest them are doing more harms to themselves by using alcohol than they're doing using cannabis. So it's an appalling example of policy damaging the sort of harmony in our society. And of course, the attack on cannabis recreational use has actually had a huge negative impact on the possibility of using it for medical purposes. Here are a couple of nice images. Cannabis is one of the oldest medicines, maybe the oldest medicine in the world. And it was legal in this country till 1971. When it got banned, as I've said, because of American pressure to ban all drugs, and because 2 GPs in London were prescribing cannabis and telling people to dry it out on cigarettes, on tobacco, and smoke it. We go back 100 years, there's Queen Victoria, most powerful woman that's ever lived, I imagine. And she used cannabis to deal with period pains and to deal with the pains of childbirth. And actually, it's interesting. In America now, they've now just released a new rapidly dissolving cannabis film for period pains, for those of you women who are interested in that. But that's illegal here. 100 years ago, the most powerful woman in the world could use it, could be prescribed. Now, this is where we have. This is what we have. This is actually what the Labour government did by actively enforcing a criminalisation of cannabis users. I get many emails like this. Here's a teacher in her 50s. She's in a wheelchair with multiple sclerosis. Cannabis is the only relief she gets. 3 times now, her front door has been broken down by police on dawn raids. If they rang the bell, she'd let them in because she can't jump out the window because she's in a wheelchair. Why do the police do this? Well, they do it for 2 reasons, because some of them enjoy smashing down doors. They like dressing up as military, paramilitary individuals. And, of course, they get overtime as well, because it happens at 3 in the morning. And if this woman's convicted again, she must go to prison. So her life is in the hands of the police, because she still uses cannabis, because that's the only relief she gets. And I think, well, that's not the kind of society I want to live in, really. It's certainly, the attack on her is completely disproportionate to the possible harms that cannabis might be doing to her. And it's even more outrageous when you think of the benefit it's doing. And I think Queen Victoria would not have been amused by that. But the war on cannabis has done something even worse. It's opened this Pandora's box of spice. Did you hear this morning, Leicester Prison? Prisoners are rioting to get spice. Spice is a generic term for a whole range of synthetic cannabinoids. When people started clamping down on cannabis, sensible middle-class people said, well, I don't want to get arrested for having cannabis. Can I find an alternative? There are many thousand variants of cannabis which have been made by the pharmaceutical industry in the 1970s. They were ignored, they were disbanded. None of them came to the market because they were too toxic and unpleasant. But they have now because people would rather take the risk with their health of smoking spice than have a criminal record for using cannabis. And you can see this vast increase in seizures. So that's probably 10% of the spice. Spice is so potent that a ton of spice is enough to give probably 10 million people a high. So we have created this monster of spice. In some prisons, we have up to 75% of prisoners taking it. There are so many of them, we can't test for them. And they're so potent that you don't know what you don't have no idea what dose you're getting. And there are deaths, and there are huge numbers of people going psychotic. Now, countries like the Netherlands, which have a rational cannabis policy, i.e. legal cannabis, they don't have spice because no one needs it. Spice is a classic example of where prohibition has driven individuals to find more potent and therefore more dangerous drugs. And we've seen it before. The ban on opium led to heroin. The ban on alcohol led to methanol. The ban on cannabis has led to spice. Clamping down on cocaine led to crack. And I don't think we can ever get rid of this now. We have an almost insoluble problem. The only solution, I think, actually, is to allow all prisoners to smoke cannabis if they want. And I can't see the current Home Secretary bringing that one in. But maybe if Labour get back into power, I don't know. And we've also done really stupid things, like we've just started filling our prisons up with people who are on drug offences. You go to prison with a cannabis offence or an MDMA offence, and what do? Well, you get bored and you take heroin. So we actually put people into prison, spend £50,000 a year on each of them, and turn them into even more heavy drug users. It's ridiculous policy. So that's the sort of political aspect of it. What about the media? Because the media, in many ways, are the root of all this. And I just want to share with you this wonderful PhD data from Alasdair Forsyth. So he worked in the MRC Health Unit in Glasgow University. And in the 1990s, he did his PhD. He looked at every single coroner's case in Scotland in the 1990s, extracted every one in which a drug other than alcohol was present at death, and then went and looked at every newspaper in Scotland, local and national, to see if those deaths were reported. There were 2,255 deaths where a drug was present, and 546, about 1 in 4 got reported. And then he asked the question, is there any differential reporting of drug deaths? Well, there is. If you die of paracetamol overdose, almost never is it going to be reported. All those people would have died of paracetamol poisoning. If you die of a rare death, amphetamine, so 36 deaths with amphetamine present at death, that means probably maybe a third, maybe 12 actually died of amphetamine. Much more likely to get reported. Yeah, cocaine's down in 1 in 8 deaths, 1 in 16 from methadone. Heroin only 1 in 5. But the drug that always gets reported is ecstasy, even though there were probably about 1 death a year in Scotland from ecstasy in that period, directly due to ecstasy. So the reason everyone's terrified of ecstasy is because that's all they ever read about in the newspapers. And it's truly a very powerful example of actually how the media do have an influence, but they have an influence in the wrong direction. We should be warning people about the deaths of paracetamol, not of ecstasy. And in fact, if you want to read more about this, you can read the essay I wrote in The Guardian late last year. Almost all the calls for a prohibition of drugs in the history of the world have come from media extremists. But the police have a part of the problem too, because the police become complicit with the media in terms of reporting drug harms. And this is one of the most surreal phone conversations in my life. I was actually in Barcelona and I got a phone call from CNN. And 2 days before, I'd done an interview with them in London on mephedrone, MCAT, meow meow, finding out about what was happening. And they said, "Where's Scunthorpe?" Now, that's not a question I'd ever been asked before, certainly not by an American, and I bet none of you have. I said, "Why do you want to go to Scunthorpe?" And they said, because the Humberside police have called an international press conference to share with the world that 2 young men they think have died from taking mephedrone, MCAT. I said, that's impossible. 2 weeks before, I had seen the Israeli government report on the methadone epidemic in Israel. Methadone is an Israeli drug. It was actually invented as a way of controlling aphids on plant crops there. And then it got diverted into the Israeli youth. And their report said about 450,000 young Israelis had been using methadone for 2 years, and there was not a single death. So I said to the CNN people, well, I cannot believe that is true, but if you really want to go to Scunthorpe, then you go up the M1 for 4 hours and turn right. Now, I don't know if they found it. I presume I'm right about the instructions. But if they got there, they'd have heard this. So the police dragged down to the stage Nick's dad, the bottom lad's dad. And Nick's dad's weeping as he urges youngsters to avoid the drug. But he's not actually weeping because of the drug. He's weeping because he's looking, his son has died. And he says this, "I don't want him to be labelled a druggie because he wasn't. He was just on a night out with friends enjoying himself. A normal, caring, hard-working lad." Now, every word in that red sentence is correct except for the one I've highlighted to make it easy for you. Because he was a druggie. He was an alcohol druggie. He'd been out drinking for about 7 hours on a Sunday night in 6 different bars. And then he wandered off into Scunthorpe with his mate, and they died. And they died because they took methadone plus alcohol. Methadone is a potent opiate. It depresses respiration, particularly in conjunction with alcohol. Now, the police knew that. But you could not get CNN to go to Scunthorpe to talk about 2 deaths from an opiate and alcohol. Because they'd just say, well, there's 5 of those every night in Detroit. So that wouldn't be news. But if you say a new drug, a scary new drug, has killed people, you can get the international press there. And this hyping up of harms by the police is actually the norm. It's one way of getting CNN to Scunthorpe, the only way probably. And there was a media clamour that we've got to ban this drug, even though, as far as I know, no one had died. The drug was banned. And it was banned even though there were no deaths. Okay, you might say, well, yeah, but that's all, yeah, okay, nuts, okay, maybe it doesn't kill people, but it's not a good thing, is it, to have people taking new drugs you don't know much about? How could banning a drug do any harm? Isn't it better to be precautionary? Let's ban all drugs, and then some good might come. Well, methadone is a fascinating example because we have data now on the impact of a methadone, a free market, a drug, methadone, you could buy on the internet. In some towns, you could order it on the phone, and they would deliver it to you within the same time it takes them to deliver the bottle of scotch that you order over the phone and the pizza. So you could have mephedrone delivered to your house within an hour of ordering it. It's a relatively weak stimulant, and what you got was what was on the packet because it was legal, so people had no reason not to sell what they said they were selling. And here you see this amazing data. So cocaine deaths had risen and risen and risen despite the best efforts of the ACMD and the Home Office. If you sacked me for that, I'd have said that's fair cop. But anyway, at this point, we couldn't do anything about cocaine deaths until the free market brings in mephedrone. And people switch from not very good quality cocaine, full of rat poison and stuff, to mephedrone. And look, first 2 years, when methadrone's available, fewer people die from cocaine. Mephedrone almost certainly saved many more lives than it killed. And that's the general principle. If you give people access to a safer drug and they use it, they're not so likely to die. And that's well established. That's why we have benzodiazepines, because people were dying of barbiturates, like Marilyn Monroe. The reason we have buprenorphine, to stop people dying from heroin, and mephedrone to stop people dying from cocaine. So this is a health improvement. In fact, if I had brought that in, I would be getting a Nobel Prize probably for controlling the deaths from cocaine. But because the free market did it, no one has really taken any notice. And then, of course, the drug gets banned because the media get hysterical. And it carries on. All the supplies get used for the next year because people stockpile. And then look what happens. And now, last year, the highest number of deaths ever recorded in this country from cocaine. The reason methadone doesn't kill people is because even if you take a gram, it doesn't kill you. It's a weak stimulant. It's like a double-strength caffeine. But because it's banned, we now no longer have this benefit in terms of reducing stimulant deaths. It didn't just reduce cocaine deaths, it also reduced deaths from amphetamine. And as a doctor, you know, we always feel that we're living in the shadow of Hippocrates, and one of his axioms about medical training was primum non nocere, first do no harm. And it is a principle of medical ethics. And you think perhaps that principle might apply to the law. Wouldn't that be a sensible principle to apply to the law? I don't know. I mean, I would have thought so. But it certainly would be a great principle to apply to governments. The reality is that we have many drugs which are illegal that are potential medicines. Some of them, like cannabis, were medicines. Ecstasy was a kind of medicine before it was banned. LSD was a medicine for 15 years before it was banned. Many, many difficult to treat illnesses where people have failed on conventional treatments are amenable to treatment with these banned drugs. But the regulations, which are designed to stop recreational use and fail to do that, do stop research. They do stop studies of these drugs. In Britain, only 4 hospitals have a license to hold cannabis. Every hospital can hold heroin. Cannabis is treated as more dangerous than heroin. And when you ask the Home Office why that is, they say, because it is. And you say, well, why is it? And they say, because it always has been. And you say, but that isn't a very good answer. And then they turn away and... it is absurd that I have to have a special police check to be able to work with cannabis when I can prescribe heroin. And this censorship comes from the UN conventions, and they're arbitrary, they're political, and they've held back research for 50 years. They've also held back medical... Yeah, he's got to go and give a lecture himself. So, he told me. 2/3 of the world's population, that is the population of India and China, have no access to strong painkillers because their governments think it's easier to ban morphine than to regulate morphine. Psychedelics, which I'll show you have fascinating opportunities for therapy, are illegal everywhere in the world. MDMA is banned in most of the world. And because they're Schedule I drugs, even though governments say, we don't stop you researching them, in practice, the regulations make it virtually impossible. And I think this is the worst censorship of research. Actually, I think it's the worst censorship of research in life sciences and medical sciences in the history of the world. There's only one comparable example in the history of science, which is the banning of the telescope in 1616. And that was the Catholic Church deciding it didn't want the world to know that the Earth was not the center of the universe, that the sun was. And that ban lasted 150 years or so. The ban on psychedelics has lasted since 1961 for cannabis and 1967 for for psychedelics and LSD. You think of the growth of neuroscience research in those 50 years and how little has been done with these drugs. This is definitely, I think, the worst censorship that there probably ever has been in terms of the lost opportunities for science. If you're interested in this, which I hope some of you are, you can read the sort of definitive review in June 2013 in Nature Reviews Neuroscience, or there's a freebie in PLOS Biology, which came out last year, which is a bit easier as well, so a bit shorter. I'm going to finish by telling you how we're fighting back, and how fighting back has actually proved rather revelationary in terms of therapeutic potential. So I've been working with the Beckley Foundation, which is based near Oxford, to try to redress this 50-year moratorium on research. And we've done a number of studies, largely around psilocybin, magic mushrooms. Magic mushrooms are, well, they grow around here, they grow around most of Britain, and they contain an active ingredient called psilocybin. It's a short-acting psychedelic. We started with psilocybin for two reasons. It's short-acting, and no politician knows how to spell it, so they can't get angry. We gave it intravenously in the first experiments because we couldn't afford the cost of this to give it orally. Because once a drug's illegal, the price of manufacture goes up something like 100-fold because of all the regulatory hurdles that the chemists have to have, the suppliers have to have, and the people like me who end up storing it have to have. So it becomes prohibitively expensive. We could not afford to do it orally. We've started doing it orally now because the prices come down. And this shows a very simple demonstration of what happens in the brain. Now, when you see these kind of images of brain activity, blue means less. We assumed that giving psilocybin to people and making them have a whole sort of interesting set of geometric hallucinations, colors, shapes, and things moving around, their whole sense of body altering. We thought those powerful changes in consciousness would be associated with an increase in brain activity. But in fact, nowhere was there an increase in activity in the brain. All there was a shut-off. Amazing. I mean, no one really could have predicted that. But, and it's true, we've replicated it several times now. But the really interesting thing for this audience is that one of the regions that was powerfully switched off is this region here. And this region is the region that drives depression. This region is overactive in depression, and most, in fact, I think I can say all effective treatments for depression switch that region off. It's called the anterior subgenual cingulate cortex, and it drives depression. So switching it off should reduce depression, and in fact, many of our volunteers came out of the scanner and they felt happier, and they stayed happy for several days or weeks, and we thought, this is interesting. And we wrote a grant to the MRC. We could perhaps help people with resistant depression by giving them one single psilocybin trip and see if we could switch that region off and improve their mood. And it got funded. Amazing, he got funded because I think it's good science. The grant was awarded in 2012. It took 3 iterations by the ethics committee to allow us to do it. The most restrictive constraints I've ever seen in a study. We've had to do a pilot study with 6-month safety follow-up. But how do I say, people are eating these every weekend in Brecon, but no, 6-month safety follow-up. But that was easy, ethics was easy. It took 30 months to get the drug supply for all these regulations, and then it took 32 months to get regulatory approval. So almost all the grant was spent before we could do the study, just on going through these regulations designed to stop young people eating mushrooms in the Brecon Beacons. I mean, come on, let's get real about this. I mean, all they do is stop me doing research. But it was worth it. We did it. These are the results. They're not yet published. They're under review at the Lancet at present. And they show that a week after a single psilocybin experience, there's a massive reduction in depressive symptoms. And this effect lasts, and it lasts up to 3 months in some people. They stay well. This is a revolution. If this is true, i.e. if we can replicate it, this is a revolution in treating people with resistant depression. Nothing else has ever had that kind of power of recovery. And then there's MDMA. Any of you see the Channel 4 MDMA program? So we gave the same dose of MDMA that Leah Betts took when she died. We gave him 80 milligrams of the freebase. Luckily, none of our people died because she didn't die of ecstasy poisoning. She died of water poisoning, but that's another story. People say to me, why did you go and do something as sensational as working with Jon Snow on Channel 4? And I want to tell you the story because it's an interesting story. For 8 years, I had been writing grants to the MRC and the Wellcome Trust to get funding to study the effects of MDMA, because I argued that it's a very interesting drug. It's the only drug we know of that increases empathy, and people like each other more under it. So that's an interesting tool to study empathy. It's been used for 30 years, recreationally for 25. I reckon over 1,000 million doses, 1 billion doses of ecstasy must have been used in the world. And no one's ever done a study to find out what it does in the brain. That's got to be critical, important science. Anyway, Channel 4 came to me when they had their new head of programming, Jay Gould. And she said, would I do a program giving people cocaine live on TV? And I said, Channel 4? No, that's what the BBC do. No, and she went away, and after a month they came back and they said, well, okay, if you won't do cocaine live on TV, what Class A drug would you do? And I said, MDMA, of course, because it needs to be done. So we did it. And I think this is truly got to be the best scientific study ever done, paid for by a TV company. And again, the results are remarkable. So MDMA also switches off the brain, like psilocybin. But it switches off different parts of the brain. It switches off the parts of the brain involved in emotional regulation rather than perception. And that's why it may be useful in the treatment of PTSD, because they help people deal with the terrible emotional responses to the memories, and so they get control of them. So this is actually, again, a very important set of studies, which are almost impossible to do because the regulations make it just too hard. Now, those two studies were the subject of interest by this man, Jim Dobbin. And Jim Dobbin was a Labour MP. He was one of the few people in Parliament who actually knew how to spell the word drug, because he was a pharmacist. But he hated research with illegal drugs. And you see, after the psilocybin study, he said, why was Prof not allowed to use an illegal drug in a scientific study? And this gets back to the point I made at the beginning. This illegality paradox. If something's illegal, people think you should not work with it. And then after the MDMA study, you could see he tried to get the Home Secretary to initiate a policy of getting rid of our license to do this work. Now, this man could be the deciding vote as to whether we go to war. He could decide whether we all live or die. And his knowledge and understanding of kind of the intellectual principles underpinning science is that limited. I find that terrifying. The only good news is he's now dead, so hopefully he won't do it again. Now, but it does get worse. I thought when you break free from the Dobbin clause, you get the May clause. This is now where we are. We have royal assent to the Psychoactive Substances Act, which bans the sale of any psychoactive substance now or ever in eternity, unless till the act is revoked, even if it's harmless. There are only 3 exemptions: ethanol, nicotine, and caffeine. When you say why they're exempted on the grounds of precedence, not on the grounds of harm or safety. And the Act doesn't define what psychoactivity means. So really, anything could be illegal if it affects your brain. They banned poppers, and when I said to them, well, hang on, but if you take poppers, as one of the MPs said, who said, I take poppers, and the only thing it does is give me a damn headache. Is that psychoactivity? Do you want to ban? I mean, the law is absurd, and in fact, it probably would ban oxygen. If you had oxygen bars like in Japan, they would probably be illegal now. It is a bizarre attack on any kind of personal liberty, but also on science. Why do we have it? Well, having got rid of methadone MCAT, the Sun decided it had to take on another drug, and it decided to take on nitrous oxide. And they attacked football players for using balloons of nitrous oxide. The reason football players use nitrous oxide is because it doesn't test positive in their urine. They're not as stupid as you think they are. So how do you get rid of a drug like nitrous oxide? Well, the first thing is you give it a dangerous name, and you call it hippie crack. And you can imagine, all these middle-aged Tory voting people, oh my God, hippies are coming back and they're taking crack. We've got to stop this. And no self-respecting hippie would ever take nitrous. And it's not a bit like crack. It's no remotely like crack. I don't know who invented this word, but it's good enough to scare people. Newspapers don't have to justify those kind of hysteria. I'm very attached to nitrous oxide because it's a Bristol drug, and I'm a Bristol boy. Here's Humphrey Davy, the greatest ever chemist in this country ever produced. Used to work in hot wells. Priestley, his colleague, discovered nitrous oxide. Davy researched it, used it, enjoyed it, used it to help have fun when he didn't want to get drunk. In 200 years, it's been around. It was about 1807 it was discovered. There have been no accidental deaths, a few suicides. But I have to tell you, more people die each year of helium than of nitrous. But we don't know if helium is psychoactive, because, of course, no one knows of anything psychoactive, because they haven't defined it. Coleridge, Southey used it sometimes instead of opium for their poetic inspiration. Millions of women use it in childbirth. I was given it just a few months ago, and I broke my wrist. They tried to reset it. It was unpleasant and a bit nauseous-making. Certainly didn't terrify me. And no one really got upset when Prince Harry used it. But if a footballer is using it, and they're mostly what newspapers write about, then that's dangerous. So we've got to get rid of nitrous oxide. And I just want to share with you two footballers taking nitrous oxide. On one side, you've got Raheem Sterling, who's been vilified by the Sun for his balloon. The other side, you've got Luke Shaw. I think he plays for Man United, doesn't he? Or did, until he had his legs smashed up. Now, when you hear someone being stretchered off like Luke, and given oxygen, that is a lie. They're not being given oxygen. They don't need to. They're at ground level, or sea level, or near. They're being given nitrous oxide to deal with the pain of the broken leg. So people don't realise that nitrous oxide is actually a good thing. They only see the supposed bad thing of someone having a short-term, a transient piece of sort of euphoria from inhaling a balloon of nitrous. Why have we done this? Well, I think the truth is basically the media have to ban drugs. I think some editors of newspapers, they're too old to have sex. They don't chip on the bedstead people they've had sex with. They just chip how many drugs they got banned. I think it's a kind of metric of harm, a metric of achievement. And there's this local antipathy. So this act, the Psychoactive Substances Act, is really an act about banning head shops, because head shops are the new sex shops. Some of you won't know what a sex shop was. So before the internet, people used to go into... The driver is interesting. The people that have campaigned viciously to get this act is this Centre for Social Policy. This is Ian Duncan Smith's think tank. This is a right-wing Christian Puritan think tank. It's got funding from strange charities which have come at arm's length out of the American military or military industry. And they want actually to get rid of anything that might give you pleasure, other than whipping yourself. And they've lied consistently. This act is based on their lies about there being 100 deaths from legal highs each year, even though we published in The Lancet a critique of their claim showing that actually, in reality, almost all the drugs that are called legal highs are illegal, and some of them have been illegal as long as MDMA has been illegal, like 30 years. So as Disraeli said, there are lies, damn lies, and statistics, and there are lies, damn lies, and legal high statistics. The Misuse of Drugs Act actually has worked well here. We reckon there's about 5 deaths a year from real legal highs. And that's because the head shops don't want their customers to die, because a dead customer isn't a good customer. So they only sell things that are just safe, the things that they've used themselves. And they can also guide people on dosing and how, repetition, etc. Even though that's illegal, they're not allowed to do that, they do that. Now they've gone, it's all in the black market. You go to a black market to get legal highs, you'll always be offered much more dangerous drugs like heroin and cocaine, because that's where the profit is. Or you go to the internet and you have no idea what you're getting. So we have just essentially used this massively restrictive piece of legislation to shut down about 58 head shops in this country. And the driver behind that is this lady, Theresa May, and I want to... So many of you don't remember her when she was young. This was when she was the chairman of the Conservative Party. And when they were in opposition, in their conference in 2003, she said this, wearing her leopard skin mules, she said, "We must escape the image of being the nasty party. And I put image in red because she doesn't say we must stop being the nasty party. And that's very telling, because this is what she says now. I will stop you having fun even if it's harmless. And this is what this act is about. It's not about saving lives, because there aren't any deaths, or hardly any. This is simply about controlling the way in which young people engage with the world. And so now the only drug you can use to intoxicate yourself is alcohol, which is much more harmful than most of the drugs which were being sold as legal highs. But she's a daughter of a vicar, and this actually really what she means. This act is really saying, thou shalt have no other drug but alcohol, forever and ever, amen. Which is what the act has said. There's another side, of course, which is called the Bullingdon side. So here's David as a member of the Bullingdon Club in his outfit in Oxford as a young man. The Bullingdon Club, if you haven't seen the film The Riot Club, you should see it. It's like a documentary, but they're slightly better looking. Here they are dressed up. So they used to go on these massive binges. They used to fuel themselves up with cocaine so they could stay awake and so they could drink insane amounts of alcohol and then get into fights. And then when the police came, they'd just give them a lot of £50 notes and they would go home and clean up. And this is David on the steps there saying, the proles are complaining, we're going to ban nitrous oxide. And the next David is saying, that's Boris, by the way, if you don't recognise him when he's young. He's saying, let them snort coke, it was good enough for us. And that's the truth. That's the truth. The truth is that these young men were able to use a lot of drugs and got away with it because they were rich and white and lived in Oxford. And now they come to rule us. They have forgotten that. Or maybe they just feel that if they're clever enough to get away with it, other people should be. I think this is perhaps the worst law ever. In terms of a moral law, it's immoral. It pushes people to use drugs like alcohol, which is more dangerous than many drugs. We know it will increase harms and deaths through the black market. The Irish brought it in 4 years ago. They've had 5 prosecutions, and so they've closed their head shops, but death rates are going up. And the Irish have the highest use of psychoactive substances in Europe. It's based on lies, false premises. It bans safe substances like nitrous. And it's anti-scientific. There was no mention in the first reading of the bill anything about science. And when we said to them, well, hang on, this will stop all brain science, they said, what's that? And we said, that's things that people like us at universities do. Oh, what are the... So anyway, we've managed to get scientific research exempted, but in a way which is not very clear, and I'm not confident that science is properly protected, because a lot will depend on the interpretation of the people who make drugs for us as to whether they're psychoactive or not. And I think this is the worst law since the first Elizabeth brought in the Act of Supremacy in 1559. For those of you who weren't there then, what she said was, basically you have to believe in the Anglican communion, not the Catholic communion. I don't know what the difference is. I suppose most of you don't either. But it was important in those days, because if you got the wrong one, you were burnt at the stake. I'm going to finish now. I'm going to finish by telling you what I think should be the underpinning principle of our laws. This is after John Stuart Mill, who said, in a freedom-loving society, no conduct by rational adults should be criminalized unless it's harmful to others. When I started working, helping the government make sense of drugs, I kind of assumed that that was the principle on which the British state, even though we haven't got a constitution, was based. It's become absolutely apparent to me now in the last 10 years that that is not the case, but it should be. And hopefully you will work in appropriate ways to change the politics and the media in this country to make that the underpinning principle. Thank you very much.
Professor Nutt, thank you very much indeed for that very engaging and compelling presentation. We have some time for questions until about 7 o'clock, so if you've got some questions, do put your hand up now.
If you shout them out, I can actually repeat them if you want to shout them out.
I will start then, because people always take time to warm up on these things. Can you say a little bit about what's happened in countries where the use of drugs has been decriminalised. You mentioned in passing Holland. Yes. I wonder if you say something about places like Portugal, where it's no longer criminal to possess.
Yeah. So one of people's when you talk about changing the drug laws, a lot of people get hysterical. But we don't know what's going to happen. It could all fall apart. And you say, well, hang on a sec. Let's look at the Netherlands, shall we? You know, the Netherlands had legal cannabis for over 30 years. Why did the Dutch decide to make cannabis legal? The answer is very straightforward. That they did not want their young people, who they knew would use cannabis, because they knew that all young people were going to use cannabis, they didn't want them getting their cannabis from a dealer, because they knew the dealer would always offer them, as they do in this country. You go and buy cannabis from a dealer, they'll try to do kind of a 2-for-1. Look, take the cannabis, but have a little bit of this crack, or have a little bit of this smack. So they wanted to separate the heroin markets from the cannabis markets by putting the cannabis market into a regulated environment called a cafe. And it was so successful that they had about the lowest use of heroin in young people in Europe. They got rid of intravenous heroin injections from their population by separating the markets. And as I said to politicians, well, you know, the remarkable thing about that is that their economy is better than ours and their football team's better than ours. So, you know, legal cannabis doesn't destroy society. And actually, Amsterdam is a hell of a lot nicer place to be on a Saturday night than downtown Bristol. The Portuguese experiment was a rather different experiment. The Portuguese experiment was in a sense, in many ways, something that the Portuguese were forced to do because they, by applying the UN conventions in the strictest sense, they were going bankrupt. Like many American states are. Putting people in prison for drug offenses for long periods costs a lot of money. And they said, no, we're going to stop. We're not going to criminalize people for possession of drugs. And I completely endorse that. Criminalizing someone for possessing a drug, in almost all cases, will do more harm than the drug. If you get a criminal record, then you ain't going to be Prime Minister, which is why David Cameron was lucky he escaped both his cannabis and his cocaine use being detected. However, you can deal with drugs in a different way, and what they've done is they've decriminalized personal use, but they treat it as a civil sanction, like a speeding offence or a littering offence. So you get fined, you get taught, you get, if you're ill, you get treated, but they don't waste police time on prosecuting you, and they don't put you in prison. And there's another remarkable benefit, and I have to say the guy that pioneered the Portuguese experiment, Tony Wilde, is coming over in speaking in London on the 11th of May, if you want to hear him, to give us a 13-year update. But the other great output of this was that it allowed people who were addicted to get into treatment, because putting people who've got drug addictions into prison is even more stupid for two reasons. One is that they're ill, they need treatment. And secondly, if they're in prison and they need drugs, they will corrupt the prison officers to get the drugs. So in Portugal and in other countries, like some of the Australian states which decriminalized cannabis, you find there's a lot people go into treatment quickly. And so they don't have to be, they don't have the habit anymore, so they don't have to keep on being drug dealers to feed their habit. So it's a virtuous circle. And now we've seen most of South American countries have actually stopped criminalizing drug possession. We've seen all the US states that have decriminalized cannabis use. It seems very likely that Canada will make cannabis legal across Canada in the next year or so. So that we've got good examples of rational policies, that are not only rational and scientific, but also much more humane than our policies, actually leading to better outcomes and saving people money.
Right, let's go. Yes, gentleman here, yeah.
Thanks. I would point out that it's not just drugs that are being vilified by the present government, it's alcohol as well. And if you look at the Chief Medical Officer's report, the science in there is amazingly poor. And do you know of any other example of where you say any drinking of any alcohol is going to see you in A&E by next Tuesday, where in fact the risks of relatively low amounts of alcohol are relatively low?
Yeah, no, the alcohol is obviously a challenging issue for government. I mean, remember, under the coalition, 2 years into coalition, David Cameron says we're going to have minimum pricing. 2 years later, the drinks industry have told him that doesn't work, even though it does work. So it's everything around alcohol is so highly politicized. But the reality with alcohol is that there is an inexorable relationship between consumption and harm. But the slope at low levels of consumption is not very great. And that's why we've set our thresholds at 14 units per week for men and women. The drinks industry, of course, has actually tried to turn that into a target for health, but it's not. It's a threshold, it's a maximal recommended amount. If you drink 100 units a week instead of 14 units a week, you increase your risks of dying from an alcohol-related disorder not by sixfold, but by tenfold. So this non-linear relationship between consumption and harm is actually one of the problems with alcohol. And well, as I showed you, there's 22,000 premature deaths, and that's gone up by about 4% last year, so it'll be more like... So alcohol does kill people, and it kills young people. So yes, it is a harmful drug, but if you drink in moderation, if you stick to less than the 14 units a week, not a day, right? A week, you won't come to a great deal of harm. It's not... That level of consumption is about the same as not exercising for a week. It's that kind of level of harm.
Thank you, Dave. Really enjoyed that, and it's very depressing in a way, because what you're giving us are a series of trends, including things like sacking advisors, everything getting worse, and so on. So should we simply be depressed by this, or can you see ways of actually turning this around? Because one of the things you're saying is that the good examples that are out there are not having an impact. The science is not having an impact. So what will have an impact, and how can we turn these policies around?
I don't think I haven't thought about that. So what I've been trying to do with alcohol is to try to get people to realize that the systematic dishonesty that you get when anyone tries to put forward a pricing control for alcohol is just outrageous. So if anyone says minimum pricing, the Sun and the Mail say, nanny state, taxing the responsible drinker, penalizing the middle class. And the journalists write this rubbish because the drinks industry feed them a lot of alcohol. Lunchtime booze it's not a fantasy of private eye. That's actually the way it was on Fleet Street. If you look, and I read an article in The Spectator about a year ago, you can read, if you do the economics of drinking, none of you, if you could afford to come up the hill to this university, then you're all rich enough. You're all drinking alcohol that is costing more than the minimum price. We want to price alcohol at 50p a unit. I bet none of you would drink alcohol that's cheaper than 50p a unit. It's just too unpleasant. The only people that drink cheap alcohol are young people, 13, 14-year-olds getting into alcohol, and alcoholics. So minimum pricing wouldn't affect your consumption. No alcohol in a bar or a pub is priced at less than 50p a unit. So what we're trying to do is stop alcohol being priced less than water in supermarkets, which seems most people would think was a sensible thing. If we did that, if we had 50 pence per unit minimum pricing, that would reduce alcohol consumption in this country by about 10%. It would reduce harms to the extremes, the young and the old, and the alcoholics, by about 40%. And it would produce a net saving of each taxpayer of £130 a year. So that's the way I'm hoping to begin to move this argument, that you can save money by having basically pricing cheap alcohol out of the market, because the health costs and the policing costs are significant. So the average, if you're an average rate taxpayer now, you pay £1,000 a year just to allow the way we drink today. With minimum pricing of 50 pence a unit, you'd pay about 870. Yeah.
Hi. So with the legalization of cannabis in sort of the States in America, and with Obama saying that statement, in your opinion, how far along or how long would you reckon that Britain is on the way to legalizing it itself, or do you think it's something...
Well, we need a new government. The Tories won't. Even though they kind of mostly know it makes sense, but they won't do it because they would have to admit they were wrong.
Yeah.
So we need... So very interesting things happening. The Lib Dem Spring Conference is going to vote on a motion to make cannabis legal in Britain. And I'm almost certain that will be passed. And then the really interesting question is what Labour will do. I think that Corbyn is going to meet with Gual when he comes over from Portugal in May. So if the Labour Party starts being honest about evidence, then there's a chance that we might have a proper opposition that actually supports rational policies. So a lot was going to hinge on Labour.
Do you think, just on that point, do you think there are underlying changes in society that are reflected in North America, that, spread of more liberal attitudes, more social liberalism?
Well, not in this country. I mean, sorry, did you miss this bit?
No, I didn't, but I want to pick up on the gentleman's point that it isn't simply about politics, that there may be some deeper trends at work. You don't think that's the case?
Well, I'm gobsmacked that when this law was debated in the Lords, I don't know what our Lord here did, but Labour whipped its Lords to vote with the Tories on this. Most sensible Lords. The debate in the Lords was very clear. There was a strong opposition to this in the Lords on the grounds that it's stupid, it's inequitable, it's pro-alcohol, but it still got passed. And it got passed because most voters just buy the rubbish that is spewed at them by the Mail and the Sun and the Telegraph. So that's the problem. I think we're going backwards. We're the only country actually in the world, apart from Russia, that's actually gone more hostile and more against drugs and has attacked drug users more in the last decade. So I'm not hopeful for this country. No, unless there's a fundamental change in the political establishment. We might get medical cannabis in the next 5 years if we really try hard. That's my one hope, really.
Lady here, yeah.
David, I wonder if you'd just comment on whether you think that there are really too many vested interests in continuing to support the liberal use of alcohol rather than controlling it at this point.
Yeah, so I mean, we all like to drink, don't we? I mean, people say, do you drink? Of course I drink, because I don't want to get be locked up for taking other things. I mean, it would be crazy, not, and that's the problem. That's all, basically now, if you want to do something that changes the way you feel, you've got to use alcohol. So there's the sort of cultural norm. There's a drinks industry, putting huge amount. 70% of MPs get money either directly or indirectly from the drinks industry, and then there's the way that the drinks industry controls the media in a very self-serving way. It's hard to see how we can break that without scientists and health experts, really forcing the Department of Health to actually push the government into doing something. And of course, what the Treasury says, of course we know that alcohol costs 30 billion a year, but it brings in 20 billion a year in taxes, so it's better. And of course, we can't run the risk of losing those taxes if we change the pricing, because there might be a lag before we get the benefits from the health improvements. But the reality is that the health improvements come almost immediately. 40% of all intensive care beds in Scotland are occupied by people who've got alcohol dependence. And if you just stop them drinking 10% of what they normally drink, they'll be out of intensive care. So the health benefits can be almost immediate.
Could you foresee a future where perhaps with more rational legal approaches to using cannabis that people might vote with their feet and they'll all start using cannabis and they'll stop using alcohol because of the
Well, that's what we've seen. You see, that's what's... Yeah, in fact, it's a interesting... We're writing a paper looking... I've written several sort of papers looking at it, but now there's data. So we could write a theoretical paper 3 years ago or 5 years ago, but now we have data. So we know in the states in America where there is legal cannabis, and also in some of them where medical cannabis has been widely available, alcohol consumption falls, deaths on the road from alcohol fall, liver deaths fall. And more importantly, even perhaps in alcohol, is that the deaths from opiates fall, because cannabis is a better painkiller than morphine for many people. So medical cannabis is a real win. Legal cannabis is probably a win. It would almost certainly reduce alcohol deaths. Yeah.
It's a colleague here. Yeah.
So, David, when I travelled in Peru, I got a really strong impression that there were links between the very early drug culture and the very earliest roots of civilization, the earliest built environments.
Yes,
and I wondered, have you got a view on the role of all the substances that are banned in the evolution of our culture and civilization?
Well, yeah, indeed. One of the really interesting questions is, why is my brain, full of cannabis receptors? Why is it full of psilocybin receptors, LSD receptors, even ketamine sort of receptors? It's an interesting question. Why? Have our brains evolved to benefit from these natural products? Now, Terence McKenna would say yes. His view is that when the first hominids started eating mushrooms and other psychoactive plants in the middle of Africa, that those substances stimulated the brain to change brain function, to make the brain grow bigger and to make it more creative and human. I don't know if that's true, but it's an interesting theory. I mean, what we do know is that we can change the brain profoundly with these drugs. I mean, you saw the psilocybin data. You can produce long-lasting changes in well-being through a single administration of a 5-HT2A agonist. These receptors have evolved along with the human brain. There's more of them in the human brain than other brains, and they're in the parts of the brain which control brain function. So there's some reason they're there, and it might be that it's to help our brains benefit from natural products. Who knows? Certainly, people are now looking at the question of whether we can use sub-psychedelic doses of drugs like LSD to improve brain flexibility, cognitive flexibility, maybe even to prevent aging. Those studies are ongoing.
Can I ask, out of many, I'm sure, what's your biggest frustration in terms of the way that the media misrepresent your own views?
Oh, my biggest frustration... Oh, sorry, Karen.
Yeah, and and also, what do you think would have to happen for their behaviour to improve, if that's even possible?
Oh, the solution's very easy. We just need a law in this country, like other countries have, which we don't allow foreign owners of our newspapers. It's outrageous that all the newspapers that are kind of ultra-right-wing are owned by people who don't live in this country. The Northcliffes live in the Mail. They live in France. They don't pay tax because we have some old treaty. They run the Mail. The Barclay brothers live in Sark. They don't pay tax there, and they run the Telegraph. And Murdoch, I don't know where he lives, but he's certainly in Britain. So we have a press which is controlled by people from overseas who actually, I think, because we allow that, they love manipulating our politicians. I'm sure Murdoch was wetting himself when Tony Blair went to see him on his yacht or wherever he went to see him. I'm sure he thought, this is great. I now rule the world. I rule Britain, and through Blair we'll control Bush. That sort of rubbish. We haven't got a free press in this country. That's what we have to do. We've got to stop foreign ownership of our media.
Any more questions? Yeah, gentleman here.
I'm going to make a parallel, and I was wondering if you had made this parallel before. The parallel is with GM crops.
Yeah.
So that the role of the media and the Daily Mail, that banning them in the EU in terms of they haven't caused any deaths, but where is it they all?
Look, the media exists to sell newspapers, and they'll lie and cheat and create hysteria to sell newspapers. That's what it's about. And I sometimes think it's absolutely perverse. I think it's almost they do it just to see how stupid we are.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. You flagged issues of evidence, and I just wanted to ask some questions about that. So one of your problems is lack of evidence because of the difficulty of researching this area. But conversely, is there also a problem of excess, very poor quality evidence that's been funded, say, by the alcohol industry to downplay, the risks of alcohol? And if we were to take a kind of broader approach to trying to look at drugs, your argument that actually these are all drugs, and if we looked at these all together and tried to work to a model of funding the research in a different way. So in Thailand, there's a tax on tobacco and alcohol that goes into the Health Promotion Foundation and funds research. And I'm just wondering if that is a way through to try and address these harms collectively.
Way through. Hypothecated tax on drugs to support drug research. Yes, that's a brilliant way. It used to happen in Finland until Finland joined the EU, and then they said it was anti-competitive, so they got rid of it. Look, you've got to understand that the economic arguments that are masquerade or are presented as health arguments are so powerful that even left-wing governments, like the Blair government, could not stand up to them. So I'm afraid it's we have. I mean, you saw what's happened for the Cabinet Office this week when they've basically said charities are no longer allowed. If they take government money, they can't oppose government policy. That's driven by something I think called the Institute of Economic Affairs, which seems to be a front for the drinks industry, who don't want people to challenge this issue of tax. So, we don't live in a democracy anymore. We live in it's a kind of oligarchy of Russians and media moguls and Americans, and we got to break free of that. And I just hope that Corbyn can do that for us.
So I wanted to follow up Anna's question, really. It's not so much about how you would go about funding science, but about the whole question of conflict of interest. Now, I don't know if the people who you are denouncing as being idiot scientists had conflicts of interest, but that's one of the key things one comes across, isn't it, in discussions about scientific evidence on alcohol or tobacco or some of the other issues, is that there are systematic conflicts of interest, which are sometimes not declared. And do you think that has a significant effect?
Well, I can tell you that the person that said that a spliff kills 1 million cells in the hippocampus was paid a huge amount of money to give a pro-alcohol talk by the Portman Group. I don't know if that's a conflict, but I can say is
that
their
is a
knowledge
conflict.
of cannabis was rather limited.
People may not know that the Portman Group is, of course, a lobby group which is run by the drinks industry.
Yeah, that's right. So that's one obvious conflict. They paid her to be anti-cannabis and pro-alcohol. The president of the Royal College of General Practitioners, I think, was just reading the newspapers and thought that they were right when they said that skunk is 100 times. I think she just didn't understand because she's not a pharmacologist. And the other scientist, it's a different kind of conflict there. The conflict of when you think you've discovered something important, that cannabis causes schizophrenia, and you're going to get the Nobel Prize. That's a hard thing to get go of. And of course, when it suits government policy, and they give you a knighthood, then that's that's also kind of incentivizes you to keep preaching it.
Oh, yeah, really good talk. I was just wondering, we haven't really talked too much about tobacco.
No.
But I've noticed, personally, I've noticed an awful lot of changes with the vaping culture.
Yeah, mm-hmm.
And I know a lot of people who've managed to give up smoking through that. And the thing that strikes me is that may be something that also applies. So it's not necessarily the nicotine which is the harmful part. It's obviously all the smoking part of it.
Yes, of course. No, vaping is... Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering whether, also if you look at, I know from Sweden, they obviously don't smoke, they snooze it. So the obvious thing is to go in that direction. I just wonder what your comments would be on that.
I would completely agree. The obvious thing is to do what the Swedes did. The Swedes, when it became very clear 40 years ago that smoking caused lung cancer, they said, can we find a non-smokable form of tobacco which won't cause lung cancer? They researched it. They grew their own tobacco. They didn't purify it. They didn't treat it with things like nitrites to make it burn. They just had tobacco, pure, clean tobacco that you could put in a pouch and put under your lip, and it's snus. And in the last 40 years, the cigarettes have almost died out in Sweden, and everyone uses snus. Lung cancer has almost died out in Sweden because people use snus. Heart disease has fallen in Sweden. So we have a solution to the problem. We have snus. When Sweden joined the European Union was still subsidizing the growth of tobacco in Greece and in Italy. And they said, you've got to stop selling snus because it's anti-competitive. And the Swedes said no. But they won't allow snus sold anywhere else in Europe because it's anti-competitive with the tobacco industry. So basically profit dominates the decision-making about alcohol and tobacco in Europe. And that's how the alcohol industry is trying to stop the Scottish minimum pricing law. They're trying to do it on grounds of competition, not on the grounds of health. So now the European Court is taking the Copenhagen city to court because Copenhagen allows snus. Absurd. Now, so okay, put snus to one side, but let's look at vaping. Now, actually, vaping is a really interesting example, a logical thing, because most of the harm from smoking cigarettes comes from the burning tobacco. It doesn't come from the nicotine. Some of the addiction comes from the nicotine. Now, Britain has done well. We're actually one of the few countries in the world which has actively encouraged vaping. We don't have restrictive controls on it. We have done good research to show that it helps people stop smoking. We've got it into smoking cessation clinics. We've even now got a vaping tool which we can use in prisons to stop prisoners smoking. That's being piloted in Wales at present. So vaping is brilliant. That's one example where Britain really has led the world. One of the problems is that the European directive on vaping, which is going to come out shortly, is going to ban all that. So we're going to have a bit of balls here. We're going to have to say we're not going to comply with the European regulations on this. And most of the rest of the world are hysterical about vaping because I don't know if have you followed this story? So I have been vilified in both the Lancet and the BMJ for publishing a paper which showed, on the best evidence we have, at least 2 years ago this was, and it's got better since, that vaping is at least 1/25th as harmful as cigarette smoking. So we published that paper and compared it with snus and other forms of nicotine. And then when Public Health England last August turned it from 1/25th as harmful to 95% safer, the world went ape. And we've been attacked viciously. And the anti-vaping lobby is a fascinating lobby because it's the big tobacco who don't want vaping because it's going to cut into their profits. And it's these Puritans who don't want any drugs. And it's a bit like the sort of, it's a bit like the Stalin-Hitler pact. You've got the two extremes coming together, attacking us in the middle. And we have to fight daily. Daily, we have to fight. We have to almost daily take out kind of legal letters against people all over the world who claim that we were paid to make that decision by the tobacco industry, which is we had no input into that at all. So we have so vaping is I've said, I think vaping could be the greatest health advance since vaccination. But it may be destroyed if we don't allow people to vape. And the regulations that they're thinking of bringing in the States and in Europe could be completely destructive to it.
Hello. Can I just ask what your views are on powdered alcohol?
On what?
On powdered alcohol?
Yeah, so a nanoparticle article. Well, I think it's going to be too expensive to be of any relevance. And in the current day, what does it matter? Because you can just buy alcohol. I don't quite see I think it's an interesting gimmick. Sure, maybe if you're climbing up mountains, and you didn't want to carry it, but the weight of, say you get rid of a bit of water, but you save 50% the weight. That's all. It's not a lot. So,
it's interesting because it's been in the press.
It's a good example of how nanotechnology is potentially quite good at delivering drugs. Yeah.
Thank you.
I was intrigued by the talk because a fundamental issue in the talk is hysteria around drugs. There is the conspiratorial view about industry and so on and so forth, but there's the fundamental issue was the hysteria created around drugs. And I was wondering where it's come from, in the sense that most of the major drugs were legal in the 19th century.
Correct.
And there was no hysteria about that. There was hostility towards alcohol during the First World War with the introduction of licensing hours and so on and so forth. So has anybody done a study to try to understand where the hysteria came from? Once the hysteria is here, then it has a certain inertia. Indeed. And it can be used for purposes which can be defined as conspiratorial or whatever it might be. But I was intrigued as to where the particular hysteria came from. You have De Quincey writing his memoirs of an opium eater and all these sort of things. These are all sort of entirely respectable stuff in the 19th century. So, and we know what happened with respect to alcohol. Where does the hysteria with other...
It's a really, really interesting question. And I'm afraid I can't be not paranoid, but I'll try to be as dispassionate as I can. So basically, there were almost, until about 1870, there were no regulations on anything, any drug, anywhere in Britain, except for the differential taxation of different strengths of alcohol. Okay, so after the gin epidemic, we decided to tax gin more than beer, and that was actually a very good way of controlling gin consumption. And then in the 1870s, people started with cannabis use through tincture. Opiate use for laudanum started to increase, and they were cheap and widely used by middle class and also the working class. Two things happened then. The first is that the pharmaceutical industry began to manufacture pure forms of them, and there was an interest in the pharma industry in having control over that market, so having pills rather than tinctures, because pills are much, much easier to sell. They've got much longer shelf life, and so they wanted to get rid of the tinctures, rid of the things that pharmacists made up, and sell the pills. And also, the Puritans started to rise. The Victorian anti-everything, anti-all drugs started to rise. And as you correctly point out, that rose to a peak in the First World War, after the First World War, many countries where alcohol got banned. It got banned in the US, it got banned in Norway, in Sweden. And we brought in controls like the licensing. Now, in the 1890s in Britain, there was a very, very powerful lobby. There was a temperance lobby, and there was an anti-laudanum lobby. And probably, and I haven't got evidence on this, but I wouldn't be surprised if the drinks industry at the time didn't collude with the anti-laudanum lobby to get laudanum banned. So opium or morphine products got banned in about 1890. And then of course the drinks industry then set apart. The Puritans then turned from opium, a little bit of cocaine, they turned to alcohol. But the drinks industry is big and it's smart and it's of course very vested because most of us drink. Alcohol is part of our life forever. Until the 1850s, it was the only safe fluid to drink in Britain because we didn't even have clean water. So it's got all its religious connotations. So alcohol is seeped into Western culture very, very deeply. And the alcohol industry fought back against prohibition. And then it decided that actually it could be even more profitable if it got rid of all drugs. So the alcohol industry has been part of the driver to eliminate all drugs. And it's still behind a lot of what we see. A lot of the attack on ecstasy was driven by the drinks industry. Because only when the rave scene in Britain, did the inexorable rise of alcohol consumption that's gone on since the 1950s actually sprung. And the drinks industry saw that as a threat, and so they tried to get ecstasy banned, and they were behind the campaigns to scare people through putting Leah Betts' picture in the billboards. So behind it, you've got the drinks industry fighting a very, very clever battle, and they've learned from the tobacco industry. They're rich and very clever, and they don't. The tobacco industry made the mistake of saying tobacco wasn't addictive, and then they were exposed for lying because they knew it was. The drinks industry, of course alcohol was addictive. We just say drink in moderation, drink responsibly. To which my reply is most people drink to lose responsibility. But they know it's a lot. They know it's a falsehood they're perpetuating, but that is enough because they control politics. So that sort of answers your question. And then the other issue, of course, was the whole legacy. If you read my Guardian essay, it's only 1,200 words, so it's easy to read. But the legacy of American alcohol prohibition was that they had created the Drug Enforcement Agency. And Harry Anslinger was the second most powerful man in America. He ran the DEA. He had the untouchables working to him. He was a movie star, effectively. And when alcohol prohibition was being rescinded, he was going to lose that. He had an army of 30,000 men working for him. And he didn't want to lose that power. So he created the fear of marijuana. He changed the name of cannabis to marijuana because that was the Mexican name. And then he started blaming Mexicans for bringing marijuana into America. He started creating fictitious tales about how stoned Mexicans were raping white women, and the young American white men were taking marijuana and then raping their mothers. They created this fictitious tales and tales of harm to justify turning the DEA from alcohol to marijuana. And that worked for 20 years, and then when people got a bit bored with that, then he changed to heroin in the 50s, and then he changed to cocaine and crack in the 70s, and then they changed now to crystal meth. So the business of policing drugs is massive business, and it keeps a lot of law enforcers employed. So there's a huge vested interest in keeping that going. There's a complicated answer, but it's hopefully I've got eliminated some of it.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Professor Lyle. I'm afraid we've now sort of come to the end of our time, but thank you very much for an incredibly interesting, wide-ranging, enormously engaging presentation. Can you thank Professor Nutt?